Learning outcomes. After studying this module, you shall be able to know about the concept of sociobiology, learn the various definitions and premises of sociobiology, understand the socio-biological explanations for behavior, and identify the criticisms of sociobiology. The concept of sociobiology first gained recognition with Wilson's publication, The New Synthesis, at a 1946 conference on genetics and social behavior. It was understood as the systematic study of the biological basis of all social behavior. According to Wilson, the biological basis of behavior implies that the social and ecological causes are the main force in the evolution of behavior in animal populations, rather than the neurological or psychological causes of behavior in individuals. According to Hagen, sociobiology is one of the scientific triumphs of the 20th century. Sociobiology is now part of the core research and curriculum of virtually all biology departments, and it is a foundation of the work of almost all field biologists. Peter Kropotkin, Richard D. Alexander, Robert Trivers, and William D. Hamilton were among the other biologists who contributed in the development of this concept. Sociobiology is often considered a branch of biology and sociology. However, it also draws from other disciplines like anthropology, evolution, zoology, archaeology, population genetics, as well as other disciplines of Darwinian anthropology, human behavioral ecology, and evolutionary psychology. This means that many of the behaviors which we believed were a result of the influence of the social environment may really be the product of biology, claims Wilson. Sociobiology lies on the nature side of the nature-nurture continuum. Sociobiology is basically a field of scientific study which is based on the assumption that social behavior has resulted from evolution, and thus it attempts to explain it within that context. Natural selection is fundamental to evolutionary theory. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection explains that the organisms which possess the traits which are less adapted to particular conditions of life have lower rates of survival and reproduction, and thus would not endure in a population. Sociobiology proposes that some behaviors are partly inherited and can be affected by natural selection. It is to say that just like physical traits are thought to have been evolved, behaviors too have evolved over time. According to many sociobiologists, many social behaviors have been shaped by natural selection, wherein behavior can be seen as an effort to preserve one's genes in the population, and certain genes or gene combinations are thought to influence particular behavioral traits from generation to generation. The idea of the inheritance of behavior arose from Haldane's idea about how altruistic behavior could be passed on from generation to generation. According to the sociobiologists, the evolution does not include only genes but also the psychological, social, and cultural features. When humans reproduce, the offsprings inherit the genes of their parents, and when parents and children share genetic, physical, and social environments, the children inherit the gene effects of their parents. Sociobiologists also believe that the different rates of reproductive success are related to different levels of wealth, social status and power within that culture. Basically, sociobiology is based upon two fundamental premises, which are: there are certain behavioral traits which are inherited, and the inherited behavioral traits have been honed by natural selection. Thus, these traits were probably adaptive in the species' evolutionary evolved environment. Sociobiology often uses Tinbergen's 4 categories of questions and explanations of animal behavior. 2 categories are at the species level, which are called the ultimate explanations, which are the function, that is adaptation, that a behavior serves, and the evolutionary process, which is phylogeny, that resulted in this functionality. And secondly, at the individual level, often called the proximate explanations, which are the development of the individual, that is ontogeny, and proximate mechanism, for example brain anatomy and hormones. When talking about sociobiology, it is important that we know that it is different from evolutionary psychology. Sociobiology differs in important ways from evolutionary psychology, which studies the animal nervous system from an evolutionary perspective, including aspects such as vision and navigation that are not necessarily related to social behavior. On the other hand, sociobiology is restricted to the biology of social behavior, but also studies organisms like plants. Moreover, evolutionary psychologists focus on the neural mechanisms that evolved in an ancestral environment that differed from the current environment that caused behavior, whereas sociobiologists usually study only behavior in the current environment. Sociobiology as human behavioral ecology. Human behavioral ecology, or HBE, or human evolutionary ecology, is the current evolutionary social science which is linked to sociobiology. Other common names are evolutionary anthropology or Darwinian ecological anthropology. HBE has a lot in common with the non-human behavioral ecology since it shares its focus on behavior rather than the psychological mechanisms described in evolutionary psychology. However, unlike non-human behavioral ecology, it uses Grafham's phenotypic approach, wherein it does not attempt to describe the genetic or other resources employed in the development of the behavior. The central purpose of the HBE approach is to use the assumption that human behavioral strategies are adaptations as a heuristic to identify the evolutionary and ecological causes of variation in human behavior. Behavioral strategies in HBE are usually described as complex behavioral dispositions which involve behavioral responses to local stimuli, thereby producing a set of different responses to a set of different stimuli. HBEs usually describe behavioral strategies in terms of an epigenetic or a decision rule, which is usually given as a mathematical function giving various values for response conditions onto the values for the behavioral output. HBEs observe sets of overt behaviors in a context of a variety of ecological conditions which could be the response conditions. The basic idea is that if human behavioral strategies are adaptations, then the relationships between behavioral responses and local ecological conditions that resemble those of the human evolutionary past can be expected to be optimal, thus meaning that the response conditions of the strategy will be those that made the behavior fitness maximizing in the environment in which it evolved. The HBEs focus on testing their optimality model, which predicts that the responses should also occur if the description of the strategy is correct. The most important analytical tool of the behavioral ecologists is the optimality model. They are designed to show which set of possible variant behavioral strategies would maximize a local fitness currency under a range of ecological conditions. There is some debate among various philosophers and behavioral ecologists about what exactly optimality models demonstrate. Orszag and Sober claim that optimality models demonstrate that the traits in question are adaptations, that is, that the traits have evolved by natural selection. Some are of the view that they are designed to determine the outcome of natural selection in a population where natural selection is only one important force. Thus, it can be said that the model correctly predicts the observed features of the trait being studied. Parker and Maynard Smith, on the other hand, claim that testing hypotheses about the operation of natural selection itself is not what the behavioral ecologists are focusing on. The behavioral ecologists are making the preliminary assumption that a trait is an adaptation in order to test other hypotheses about it, and that they pretend as if the trait were an adaptation and use that adaptation to detect deviations from optimality that might reveal interesting constraints. An optimality model proposes two main features. First, an optimality model includes a strategy set, which is a set of descriptions of possible behavioral strategies whereby the model picks out one of these strategy descriptions as the one which is the most adaptive. Second, the description of the strategy picked out by the model is of the relationships between those dispositions and various ecological features that determine the fitness of those dispositions. Pop Sociobiology. Socio-biology is also known as Pop Sociobiology, the name given by Philip Kitcher. It is basically a view about how to study human behavior, described in a variety of literature written by Wilson and others, suited for a layman rather than an academic audience. Wilson's main focus is to show that a science which would reflect the evolutionary analysis for certain particular human behaviors is possible. However, the following are the main concerns that the critics raised about Wilson's early pop sociobiology. The first is genetic determinism. Major critics of sociobiology such as Gold and the Socio-Biology study group claim that sociobiologists are strong genetic determinists. For example, according to the SSG, there are some particular genes for behavioral traits including territoriality, indoctrinability, warfare and reciprocal altruism. These genes have been subjected to natural selection in a straightforward manner. Both of these claims are believed by the critics to be unfair analyses of the views of the sociobiologists. In the book On Human Nature, Wilson describes genes as essentially difference makers which only explain the variance in traits across a population. They are by no means independent causes for any trait in individuals, and variation in the environment also accounts for part of the variation in any trait. Moreover, Wilson also does not seem to be trying to support his claim that there are some human behaviors which are probably heritable. He also describes a variety of evidence that might identify them. It includes cross-cultural appearance, plausible homology with other closely related species, especially chimpanzees, early development of the trait in question, differences between individuals that arise without differences in the developmental environment, genetic syndromes that cause behavioral differences, and twin studies. Wilson claims that trying to change human behavior from its heritable form usually fails or causes misery. Next is ignoring learning and culture. Pop sociobiology is often accused of being insensitive to the problem of learning and culture. That is, to the problem that many traits in which they are interested are simply not subjected to natural selection at all, and it may indeed be common in humans. However, Wilson emphasized the importance of culture in many behavioral traits. He thought that even minor genetic differences that made a difference in behavior could be enhanced by acquired culture, which is the so-called multiplier effect. Furthermore, Wilson eventually went on to publish Genes, Minds and Culture with Charles Lumsden in 1981. Which was an attempt to consider the effects of cultural transmission on the nature and spread of behavioral traits and of the interaction between genes and culture. The book, however, was subjected to criticism, the major concern being that there was little substance in the models the book provided. Strong adaptationism. The third criticism of pop sociobiology was its reliance on an overly strong form of adaptationism. In both papers by the SSG and by Gold and Lewontin in their famous Spandrels of San Marco paper in 1979, the critics of sociobiology argue that sociobiologists are inclined towards a Panglossian adaptationism. The central accusations of the Spandrels paper were that adaptationists treat all traits as adaptations. They fail to recognize that the traits that are prevalent due to causes other than natural selection. They ignore developmental constraints on evolution. They fail to differentiate between current adaptiveness and a past history of natural selection. That they generate adaptationist hypotheses and fail to test them properly and replace one such hypothesis with another, often not considering other interesting kinds of evolutionary and non-evolutionary explanation. Instead, according to Gold and Lewontin, adaptationists profess purely speculative, untestable, just so stories and present them as scientific idea. Socio-biological explanations of behavior. First, helping behavior. Helping behavior is more likely to occur when it involves our children, parents, spouses or other close relations. It is less likely when it involves distant cousins or neighbors. It is not so common to come across people helping complete strangers or distant people of other cultures and races. Sociobiologists state that helping decreases with kinship distance. In fact, it occurs only when the costs we incur in helping are lesser than by the advantage that helping provides the genes we share with those relations. This is called kin selection. One kind of altruistic behavior is herd behavior. Some animals want to be close and in dangerous times closer to each other. This is adapted since by collecting in a herd, they are less likely to be attacked by a predator. Aggression. Although we usually think of animals as very aggressive, we should not confuse predation, which is the hunting and killing of other animals for food, with aggression. Predation in carnivorous species is similar to grazing in vegetarian species. Otherwise, there is remarkably little aggression in the animal world. Most often, it occurs in circumstances of competition over a resource. Animals compete for water, food, nesting areas, mates, etc. Mates account for most aggression in mammals, and usually males are the most noted for this aggression. Some of this aggressiveness is mediated by testosterone, the male hormone, but females in many species can be quite aggressive too, such as when facing a threat to her infants. Attraction. We are sexually attracted to others whose characteristics would maximize our genetic success. This means that it would give us many healthy children. Keeping this in mind, we find healthiness attractive and illness unattractive. We are also attracted to certain people for the degree to which they have certain strong masculine or feminine characteristics. Women prefer men who are taller, with broad shoulders, a square jaw, while men prefer women who are shorter than themselves, softer and rounder. Sociobiologists suggest that while men find youth and physical form most attractive, women tend to look for indications of success. Criticisms of sociobiology and behavioral ecology. There are a number of philosophical criticisms of behavioral ecology and pop sociobiology and the methods which are followed. Adaptationism. Perhaps the most important of all these criticisms of pop sociobiology was that it was excessively adaptationist. Behavioral ecologists, including the HBEs, are immensely methodological adaptationists, whereby they assume that natural selection optimizes the trait they are studying as a heuristic in order to establish other things about that trait. Gould and Lewontin objected that adaptationist hypotheses were untestable, while Parker and Maynard Smith responded to Gould and Lewontin's objection that adaptationists do not properly account for phylogenetic and developmental constraints. They argued that they are often built into the strategy set or are otherwise implicit in those models. Gould and Lewontin have moreover proposed that these models do not allow scientists to consider non-adaptationist explanations for the traits to which they are applied, such as whether those traits were fixed by drift or are simply the side effects of other traits. It is said that methods can help identify cases where a trait is a non-adaptation. The heritability of behavioral traits. The pop sociobiologists cannot be solely called the genetic determinists. However, an objection can be raised to both pop sociobiology and to the later forms of human and non-human behavioral ecology. That is, that any trait to be an adaptation requires that it should be heritable, and most human behaviors are not heritable. Heritability implies that if the parent has that trait, then the trait tends also to appear in the offspring. A more exhaustive definition of heritability is that a heritable trait T is one where variation in T is associated with the variation in genes as opposed to variation in the environment and heritability. Thus, when T increases the average number of offspring of its possessors, those offspring have to reliably also have T if T is to spread at the expense of other variants. The problem, however, is that many human behavioral traits do not seem likely to be heritable in this way. According to the HBEs, the local patterns of overt behavior are manifestations of more general strategies. They propose that the differences in the environment cause the manifestations of different elements of the complex behavioral dispositions humans possess. A behavioral strategy is, after all, simply a complex behavioral disposition which involves responding in a variety of specific ways to a set of environmental cues, most of which would be acquired by having an appropriate psychological or dispositional mechanism. Some philosophers are of the view that it is possible for traits to be adaptations in the standard sense, even when they are not heritable according to the norms of the population genetic definition. The genes were believed to be the only developmental resource transmitted to the offspring. Therefore, heritability in the population genetic sense was believed to also be necessary for natural selection. However, recently a variety of philosophers and scientists have argued that natural selection can occur on traits, even if traits vary most with the environment. There are others who have argued that the adaptationist methods cannot explain all the culturally transmitted traits because many of these traits are not heritable, and therefore they cannot be termed as adaptations. Behavioral versus psychological focus. Another problem for behavioral ecology and sociobiology is their focus on trying to understand the biological basis of behavior. The behavioral focus made sense to those behavioral ecologists influenced by Lorenz and Tinbergen's ethology, but once cognitive psychologists became interested in applying evolutionary thinking to their work, the effects of the cognitive revolution in psychology began to influence the sociobiological thinkers, and they transformed sociobiology into evolutionary psychology. As a result, many psychologists came to regard the proper target of explanation in psychology to be genuinely psychological states rather than behavioral dispositions. More recently, philosophers have also presented some arguments for one side or the other of this issue. Buller in 2005 argued that behaviors cannot be adaptations because they are not heritable, whereas psychological mechanisms are. Another argument in the philosophical literature for thinking that behaviors are not the proper targets of natural selection explanations is that behaviors are not quasi-independent in the way that they need to be evolved by selection in their own right. Hence, it can be seen that sociobiology has many criticisms. The first criticism is that it is inadequate to account for human behavior because it ignores the contributions of mind and culture. The second criticism of sociobiology is that it relies on genetic determinism, which implies approval of the status quo. Sociobiology remains of prime interest to the philosophers. More than 30 years after Wilson's book, it is still very much controversial whether or not humans do in fact have any behavioral traits which have universal biological adaptations. It can be concluded that there are many debates surrounding sociobiology which are still ongoing. For example, while methodological adaptationism continues to remain the standard approach in behavioral ecology, similarly, there has been an increasing interest in the role of culture in the nature and history of human behavior. Work studying the evolution of culture has increased since Lumsden and Wilson published their book. Philosophers and scientists are still addressing questions about how far cultural traits can be said to evolve and whether traits that have evolved can be considered adaptations in any sense. To summarize, according to Wilson, the biological basis of behavior implies that the social and ecological causes are the main force in the evolution of behavior in animal populations, rather than the neurological or psychological causes of behavior in individuals. According to many sociobiologists, many social behaviors have been shaped by natural selection, wherein behavior can be seen as an effort to preserve one's genes in the population, and certain genes or gene combinations are thought to influence particular behavioral traits from generation to generation. Sociobiology is based upon two fundamental premises, which are: there are certain behavioral traits which are inherited, and the inherited behavioral traits have been honed by natural selection, and thus these traits were probably adaptive in the species' evolutionary evolved environment. Sociobiology often uses Tinbergen's 4 categories of questions and explanations of animal behavior. 2 categories are at the species level, called the ultimate explanations, and secondly at the individual level, often called proximate explanations. Sociobiology differs in important ways from evolutionary psychology. Human behavioral ecology or human evolutionary ecology is the current evolutionary social science linked to sociobiology. Sociobiology is also known as Pop Sociobiology, the name given by Philip Kitcher in 1985. It is basically a view about how to study human behavior, described in a variety of literature written by Wilson and others, suited for a layman rather than an academic audience. The main concerns of pop sociobiology are genetic determinism, ignoring learning and culture, and strong adaptationism. Sociobiology can be used to explain various behaviors like helping behavior, aggression, attraction, etc. Sociobiology has been criticized on many grounds.